There once lived a man who married twice, and his second wife was the haughtiest and most stuck-up woman in the world. She already had 2 daughters of her own, and her children took after her in every way. Her new husband's first wife had given him a daughter of his own before she died, but she was a lovely and sweet-natured girl, very like her own natural mother, who had been a kind and gentle woman. The second wedding was hardly over before the stepmother showed her true colors. Her new daughter was so lovable that she made her own children seem even more unpleasant, by contrast, so she found the girl insufferable. She gave her all the rough work about the house to do, washing the pots and pans, cleaning out Madame's bedroom and those of her stepsisters too. She slept at the top of the house in a garret on a thin, lumpy mattress, while her stepsisters had rooms with fitted carpets, soft beds, and mirrors in which they could see themselves from head to foot. The poor girl bore everything patiently and dared not complain to her father because he would have lost his temper with her. His new wife ruled him with a rod of iron. When the housework was all done, she would tuck herself away in the chimney corner to sit quietly among the cinders, the only place of privacy she could find, and so the family nicknamed her Cinderbritches. But the younger sister, who was less spiteful than the older one, changed her nickname to Cinderella. Yet even in her dirty clothes, Cinderella could not help but be 100 times more beautiful than her sisters, however magnificently they dressed themselves up. The king's son decided to hold a ball to which he invited all the aristocracy. Our 2 young ladies received their invitations, for they were well connected. Busy and happy, they set about choosing the dresses and hairstyles that would suit them best, and that made more work for Cinderella, who had to iron her sisters' petticoats and starch their ruffles. They could talk about nothing except what they were going to wear. "I shall wear my red velvet with the lace trimming," said the eldest. "Well, I shall wear just a simple skirt, but put my coat with the golden flowers over it, and of course, there's always my diamond necklace, which is really rather special," said the youngest. They sent for a good hairdresser to cut and curl their hair, and they bought the best cosmetics. They called Cinderella to ask for her advice because she had excellent taste. Cinderella helped them to look as pretty as they could, and they were very glad of her assistance, although they did not show it. As she was combing their hair, they said to her, "Cinderella, dear, wouldn't you like to go to the ball yourself?" "Oh, don't make fun of me, my ladies. How could I possibly go to the ball?" Quite right, too. Everyone would laugh themselves silly to see Cinderbritches at a ball. Any other girl but Cinderella would have made horrid tangles of their hair after that, out of spite. But she was kind and resisted the temptation. The stepsisters could not eat for 2 days. They were so excited. They broke more than a dozen corset laces because they pulled them in so tightly in order to make themselves look slender, and they were always primping in front of the mirror. At last, the great day arrived. When they went off, Cinderella watched them until they were out of sight and then began to cry. Her godmother saw how she was crying and asked her what the matter was. I want to." But Cinderella was crying so hard she could not get the words out. Her godmother was a fairy. She said, "I think you're crying because you want to go to the ball." "Yes," said Cinderella, sighing. "If you are a good girl, I'll send you there," said her godmother. She took her into her own room and said, "Go into the garden and pick me a pumpkin." Cinderella went out to the garden and picked the finest pumpkin she could find. She took it to her godmother, although she could not imagine how a pumpkin was going to help her get to the ball. Her godmother hollowed out the pumpkin until there was nothing left but the shell, struck it with her ring, and instantly the pumpkin changed into a beautiful golden coach. Then the godmother went to look in the mousetrap and found 6 live mice there. She told Cinderella to lift up the lid of the trap enough to let the mice come out one by one, and, as each mouse crept out, she struck it lightly with her ring. At the touch of the ring, each mouse changed into a carriage horse. Soon the coach had 6 dappled grays to draw it. Then she asked herself what would do for a coachman. "I'll go and see if there's a rat in the rat trap," said Cinderella. "A rat would make a splendid coachman." "Yes, indeed," said her godmother. "Go and see." There were 3 fat rats in the rat trap that Cinderella brought to her. One had particularly fine whiskers, so the godmother chose that one. When she struck him with her ring, he changed into a plump coachman who had the most imposing mustache you could wish to see. "If you look behind the watering can in the garden, you'll find 6 lizards," the godmother told Cinderella. "Bring them to me." No sooner had Cinderella brought them to her godmother than the lizards were all changed into footmen, who stepped up behind the carriage in their laced uniforms and hung on as if they had done nothing else all their lives. The fairy said to Cinderella, "There you are. Now you can go to the ball. Aren't you pleased?" "Yes, of course. But how can I possibly go to the ball in these wretched rags?" The godmother had only to touch her with her ring, and Cinderella's workaday overalls and apron changed into a dress of cloth of gold and silver, embroidered with precious stones. Then she gave her the prettiest pair of glass slippers. Now Cinderella was ready. She climbed into the coach, but her godmother told her she must be home by midnight, because if she stayed at the ball one moment more, her coach would turn back into a pumpkin, her horses to mice, her footmen to lizards, and her clothes back into overalls again. She promised her godmother that she would be sure to return from the ball before midnight. Then she drove off. The king's son had been told that a great princess, hitherto unknown to anyone present, was about to arrive at the ball and ran to receive her. He himself helped her down from her carriage with his royal hand and led her into the ballroom where all the guests were assembled. As soon as they saw her, an enormous silence descended. The dancing ceased, the fiddlers forgot to ply their bows as the entire company gazed at this unknown lady. The only sound in the entire ballroom was a confused murmur. "Oh, isn't she beautiful?" Even the king himself, although he was an old man, could not help gazing at her and remarked to the queen that he had not seen such a lovely young lady for a long time. All the women studied her hair and her ball gown attentively so that they would be able to copy them the next day, provided they could find such a capable hairdresser, such a skillful dressmaker, such magnificent silk. The king's son seated her in the most honored place and then led her onto the dance floor. She danced so gracefully, she was still more admired. Then there was a fine supper, but the prince could not eat it all. He was too preoccupied with the young lady. She herself went and sat beside her sisters and devoted herself to entertaining them. She shared the oranges and lemons the prince had given her with them, and that surprised them very much, for they did not recognize her. While they were talking, Cinderella heard the chimes of the clock striking 11:45. She made a deep curtsy and then ran off as quickly as she could. As soon as she got home, she went to find her godmother and thanked her and told her how much she wanted to go to the ball that was to be given the following day, because the king's son had begged her to. While she was telling her godmother everything that had happened, her stepsisters knocked at the door. Cinderella hurried to let them in. "What a long time you've been," she said to them, yawning, rubbing her eyes and stretching as if she could scarcely keep awake, although she had not wanted to sleep for a single moment since they had left the house. "If you had come to the ball, you wouldn't have been sleepy," said one of the sisters. "The most beautiful princess you ever saw arrived unexpectedly, and she was so kind to us. She gave us oranges and lemons." Cinderella asked the name of the princess, but they told her nobody knew it, and the king's son was in great distress and would give anything to find out more about her. Cinderella smiled and said, "Was she really so very beautiful? Goodness me, how lucky you are, and can I never see her for myself? What a shame! Miss Javotte, lend me that old yellow dress you wear around the house so that I can go to the ball tomorrow and see her for myself." "What?" exclaimed Javotte. "Lend my dress to such a grubby little Cinderbritches as it is. It must think I've lost my reason." Cinderella had expected a refusal, and she would have been exceedingly embarrassed if her sister had relented and agreed to lend her a dress and taken her to the ball in it. Next day, the sisters went off to the ball again. Cinderella went too, but but this time she was even more beautifully dressed than the first time. The king's son did not leave her side and never stopped paying her compliments, so that the young girl was utterly absorbed in him. And time passed so quickly that she thought it must still be only 11 o'clock when she heard the chimes of midnight. She sprang to her feet and darted off as lightly as a doe. The prince sprang after her but could not catch her. In her flight, however, she let fall one of her glass slippers, and the prince tenderly picked it up. Cinderella arrived home out of breath, without her carriage, without her footmen, and her dirty old clothes again. Nothing remained of all her splendor but one of her little slippers. The prince asked the guards at the palace gate if they had seen a princess go out. They replied they had seen nobody leave the castle last night at midnight, but a ragged young girl who looked more like a kitchen maid than a fine lady. When her sisters came home from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had enjoyed themselves again, and had the beautiful princess been there. They said yes, but she had fled at the very stroke of midnight, and so promptly that she had dropped one of her little glass slippers. The king's son had found it and never took his eyes off it for the rest of the evening. So plainly he was very much in love with the beautiful young lady to whom it belonged. They spoke the truth. A few days later, the king's son publicly announced that he would marry whoever possessed the foot for which the glass slipper had been made. They made a start by trying the slipper on the feet of all the princesses, then moved on to the duchesses, then to the rest of the court, but all in vain. At last, they brought the slipper to the two sisters, who did all they could to squeeze their feet into the slipper, but could not manage it, no matter how hard they tried. Cinderella watched them. She recognized her own slipper at once. She laughed and said, "I'd like to try and see if it might not fit me." Her sisters giggled and made fun of her, but the gentleman who was in charge of the slipper trial looked at Cinderella carefully and saw how beautiful she was. Yes, he said, of course she could try on the slipper. He had received orders to try the slipper on the feet of every girl in the kingdom. He sat Cinderella down, and as soon as he saw her foot, he knew it would fit the slipper perfectly. The two sisters were very much astonished, but not half so astonished as they were when Cinderella took her own glass slipper from her pocket. At that, the godmother appeared. She struck Cinderella's overalls with her ring, and at once the old clothes were transformed to garments more magnificent than all her ball dresses. Then her sisters knew she had been the beautiful lady they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg her to forgive them for all the bad treatment she had received from them. Cinderella raised them up and kissed them and said she forgave them with all her heart and wanted them only always to love her. Then, dressed in splendor, she was taken to the prince. He thought she was more beautiful than ever and married her a few days later. Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, took her sisters to live in the palace and arranged for both of them to be married on the same day to great lords.